There are forces shaping your life right now that you do not even recognize. And that is exactly why they are so powerful. You think your hesitation is logical. Your caution is intelligent. Your delays are justified. But beneath those explanations, something quieter is influencing your decisions in ways you rarely question. It does not feel like fear. It feels like reason. It feels like your own voice. And because it feels familiar, you trust it automatically. That is how most men become controlled without realizing it. The dangerous thing about hidden fear is that it rarely announces itself openly. It does not appear as panic. It does not scream for attention. Instead, it disguises itself as careful thinking. It tells you to wait a little longer, to prepare more, to avoid unnecessary risk, to think things through one more time before acting. And while those thoughts sound responsible, they quietly create a pattern that keeps your life exactly where it is. You have felt this before. An opportunity appears. Something inside you knows you should move forward. Yet almost immediately another thought enters your mind. Maybe now is not the right time. Maybe you need more certainty. Maybe you should wait until conditions improve. The voice sounds calm, intelligent, reasonable, so you listen to it. And without realizing it, you step backward instead of forward. This is how fear secretly rules men, not through force, but through persuasion. Most people believe fear always feels intense. They imagine fear as anxiety, panic, or visible weakness. But the most dangerous fears are quiet. They convince you that hesitation is wisdom. They make delay feel responsible. They disguise themselves so effectively that you begin to defend the very patterns holding you back. Over time, these patterns shape identity. A man begins to see himself as someone who always needs more preparation, someone who waits for certainty, someone who avoids unnecessary exposure, someone who thinks carefully before acting. On the surface, these qualities appear intelligent, but underneath them, there may be something else operating quietly. Fear disguised as self-control. This is why so many capable men remain trapped for years. They are not lacking intelligence. They are not lacking ambition. They are not lacking potential. They are being governed by forces they have never learned to recognize. And once fear becomes invisible, it becomes extremely difficult to resist because the man no longer sees it as fear at all. He sees it as part of his personality, part of his decision-making process, part of who he is. That is the true danger. Because what a man accepts as identity, he stops questioning. Look carefully at your own patterns. Notice how often hesitation repeats itself. Notice how many opportunities have been delayed because you were waiting for the perfect moment. Notice how often your mind creates explanations that sound intelligent, but somehow always lead to inaction. That pattern is not random. It is one of the hidden ghosts of fear. These fears operate quietly beneath the surface of daily life. They influence how far a man is willing to go, how much risk he is willing to tolerate, how visible he allows himself to become, how confidently he moves toward opportunity. And because they operate internally, most men spend years trying to fix their lives externally while the real source of limitation remains untouched. They try harder. They force more discipline. They set bigger goals. Yet something inside them keeps slowing them down. That is because effort alone cannot overcome what remains unconscious. The real transformation begins when a man starts observing the forces influencing his behavior instead of blindly obeying them. The moment he begins questioning the thoughts that always lead to delay, something changes. The fear loses part of its disguise. It no longer feels like absolute truth. It begins to reveal itself as a pattern. And patterns can be broken. There are 6 major fears that secretly influence the lives of most men. 6 invisible forces that shape decisions, weaken action, reduce confidence, and quietly limit potential. Each one operates differently. Each one hides behind different forms of reasoning. Yet all of them produce the same result: hesitation instead of movement. The first ghost is the fear of insufficient means. This fear rarely feels emotional. It feels practical. The man under its influence tells himself he simply needs more resources before beginning, more money, more knowledge, more connections, more certainty. He convinces himself that action should wait until he is fully prepared. At first glance, this seems intelligent, but there is a hidden danger inside this pattern, because the man is no longer preparing for action. He is replacing action with preparation. Opportunity appears, and immediately the mind begins calculating what is missing. Instead of focusing on movement, it focuses on lack. The man begins thinking about everything he does not yet possess. And because he focuses on what is missing, he delays the very action that could have created the resources he needs. This is why so many men remain trapped in endless preparation. They believe readiness must come before movement, but in reality, movement creates readiness. Most men who achieved extraordinary things did not begin fully equipped. They began uncertain, they began incomplete, they began with limited resources. But through action, resources appeared. Through movement, opportunities expanded. Through engagement, they developed capability. The fearful mind resists this truth. It wants guarantees before commitment. It wants certainty before movement. It wants visible proof before risk. But life rarely works that way. The man who waits until he feels fully ready often waits forever, because readiness is not a condition that appears magically in advance. It is something developed through experience. Confidence comes after movement, not before it. Yet the ghost of insufficient means convinces a man to remain still while believing he is being wise. This is why it is so dangerous. It rewards inaction with a feeling of intelligence. The man tells himself he is avoiding mistakes. He believes he is being careful. He says he is thinking long term. But year after year, his plans remain plans. His ambitions remain ideas. His movement never fully begins. And eventually, delay becomes identity. Others begin to notice this pattern. They see a man who always talks about future possibilities but rarely acts decisively. A man who prepares constantly yet never fully commits. A man with ambition but little movement. The tragedy is that he often does not recognize the real problem. He believes he still needs more preparation. But what he truly needs is movement, because fear of insufficient means can only survive while a man remains still. The moment he acts despite incomplete conditions, the illusion begins to weaken. He discovers that he is more capable than he believed. He realizes that resources often appear through engagement rather than before it. And that realization becomes the beginning of freedom. The second ghost that secretly rules many men is the fear of criticism. This fear is quieter than most people realize because it rarely appears as direct fear. It appears as self-consciousness, as overthinking, as concern about how actions will be received by others. The man influenced by this fear does not believe he is afraid. He believes he is being careful about perception. He tells himself he is protecting his reputation, avoiding embarrassment, maintaining dignity. But beneath all of these explanations lies a deeper truth. He is allowing imagined judgment to shape his behavior. This is one of the most powerful invisible forces in human life. A man may possess talent, ambition, intelligence, and opportunity, yet still remain small because he fears exposure more than regret. He worries about what others will think if he fails. He imagines criticism before action even begins. And because the mind creates these imagined reactions so vividly, hesitation starts feeling reasonable. This is how the fear works. Before the man acts, it introduces an invisible audience into his mind. Suddenly, he is no longer focused entirely on the opportunity itself. He is focused on how others may respond to it. What if people laugh? What if they doubt him? What if he fails publicly? What if he looks foolish? The dangerous part is that most of this judgment never even happens in reality. It exists almost entirely in imagination. Yet imagined criticism can control behavior just as powerfully as real criticism when believed repeatedly enough. Think about how many men never fully express themselves because of this fear. They hide ideas, delay decisions, remain quiet, avoid visibility, lower ambition, stay inside familiar limits, not because they truly lack desire, but because they fear the emotional discomfort of being judged. Over time, this creates an invisible prison. The man begins shaping his life around acceptance instead of purpose. He adjusts behavior to remain safe in the eyes of others. He chooses familiarity over possibility because familiarity attracts less criticism. He avoids standing out because standing out invites attention. And little by little, his life becomes smaller than his potential. This fear is especially destructive because it often disguises itself as humility. The man says he does not want attention. He says he prefers privacy. He says he is simply being realistic. But deep down, there is often another force operating beneath those explanations. Fear of being seen failing. Most men do not realize how deeply criticism influences them. They assume they are making independent decisions, yet invisible social pressure quietly shapes their actions every day. They hesitate to pursue goals others may not understand. They avoid speaking boldly. They reduce ambition to remain acceptable. They wait for approval before movement. And waiting for approval is one of the fastest ways to lose momentum in life, because meaningful advancement almost always requires temporary misunderstanding. Every man who has created something significant faced criticism at some point. Every innovator, every leader, every person who stepped beyond ordinary limits was questioned before being respected. New ideas are rarely accepted immediately because unfamiliarity naturally creates resistance in people. But the man ruled by fear of criticism cannot tolerate this resistance emotionally. He interprets disapproval as danger, and because he wants to avoid discomfort, he retreats into caution. This is why so many men remain trapped in average lives while secretly carrying extraordinary potential. They fear embarrassment more than regret, and regret becomes inevitable when a man repeatedly abandons himself in order to remain acceptable. The man who overcomes this ghost operates differently. He stops requiring universal approval before taking action. He understands that criticism is not proof that he is wrong. Often, it is simply proof that he is doing something uncommon. He no longer measures decisions primarily by social acceptance. He measures them by alignment with purpose. This creates a different kind of confidence. Not arrogance, not recklessness, but independence. The man no longer constantly asks, "What will people think?" Instead, he asks, "What happens if I never fully become who I know I could be?" That question changes everything, because eventually a man realizes something painful. Criticism fades quickly, but self-betrayal stays for years. The temporary discomfort of judgment is small compared to the long-term pain of unrealized potential. Once this truth becomes clear, the invisible audience loses part of its power. The man begins acting more freely. He stops adjusting every decision around imagined reactions. He speaks more honestly, moves more decisively, takes more meaningful risks, not because criticism disappears, but because approval is no longer controlling him. This is psychological freedom, and freedom changes behavior immediately. The third ghost is the fear of losing position. This fear becomes especially dangerous after a man has already achieved some level of stability. At first, he wanted growth, expansion, opportunity. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. Instead of building towards something greater, he begins protecting what he already has. This appears responsible on the surface. Yet beneath it lies another hidden form of fear. The fear that growth may require disruption. The fear that advancement may demand change. The fear that becoming more may force him to leave behind the identity he has grown comfortable with. This fear operates quietly because it disguises itself as preservation. The man tells himself he is protecting stability, maintaining balance, avoiding unnecessary risk, but often he is simply resisting transformation. This happens to many men after reaching a comfortable level in life. They establish routines, identities, reputations, social roles. Their lives become predictable, safe, controlled. Then an opportunity appears that requires expansion, discomfort, or reinvention. Immediately, resistance appears, not because the opportunity lacks value, but because growth threatens familiarity. The man begins asking himself questions that sound intelligent but are actually rooted in fear. What if this disrupts my life? What if I lose what I already have? What if I fail after stepping beyond my current position? What if I cannot return to where I am now? These thoughts create hesitation, and hesitation creates stagnation. This is one of the great psychological traps of adulthood. A man becomes so focused on protecting his current position that he stops allowing himself to evolve. He confuses stability with fulfillment. He mistakes preservation for wisdom. Yet slowly, life becomes smaller because growth has been replaced by maintenance. The painful truth is that no meaningful advancement happens without some form of disruption. Every higher level requires a different identity, different standards, different behavior, different thinking. The man cannot become more while remaining psychologically attached to who he currently is. That is the deeper fear hidden beneath the fear of losing position, fear of becoming someone unfamiliar, because identity feels safe even when it limits growth. A man grows used to seeing himself a certain way. He knows his current environment, his current limitations, his current role, and anything that threatens to expand those boundaries creates internal resistance. The mind says, stay where things are predictable, but predictability is not always growth. Many men spend years protecting a version of themselves that no longer serves their future. They preserve routines that limit them, relationships that weaken them, habits that keep them emotionally comfortable but spiritually stagnant. And because the fear appears responsible, they rarely question it. Others observe this condition over time. They see a man who seems capable of more yet remains exactly where he is, a man who talks about possibility but avoids meaningful expansion, a man who once desired growth but now mostly protects stability. The tragic part is that he often believes he is being mature, but maturity is not refusing growth. True maturity is having the courage to evolve, even when evolution feels uncomfortable. The man who overcomes this fear understands something most people never fully grasp. What he has built is not something to cling to forever. It is something to build from. His current position is not meant to become a prison. It is meant to become a foundation. This changes his relationship with uncertainty. He no longer sees change as danger. He sees it as movement. He understands that identity must expand continuously or life begins shrinking internally, even if it appears stable externally. And once he accepts this, fear begins losing its control. The man becomes willing to release outdated versions of himself. He stops protecting limitations simply because they are familiar. He allows growth to reshape identity instead of defending the past endlessly. This creates a completely different energy. He becomes more adaptive, more courageous, more expansive. He no longer asks only, what could I lose? He also asks, what could I become if I stop protecting the version of myself that is holding me back? That question creates transformation, because the greatest threat to many men is not failure. It is comfort powerful enough to stop growth. And the moment a man recognizes this clearly, the ghost begins losing its disguise. He sees that fear was never protecting his future. It was protecting his familiarity, and familiarity has destroyed more potential than failure ever will. The fourth ghost is the fear of rejection. This fear reaches deeper into the human mind than most men realize because it touches one of the oldest emotional instincts within us, the desire to belong. A man can appear confident externally while still being quietly controlled by the fear of exclusion internally. He wants acceptance, respect, validation, connection. And because those desires feel deeply personal, rejection can feel like a threat to identity itself. This is why rejection influences behavior so powerfully. The man begins avoiding situations where his value might not be recognized immediately. He hesitates to express interest, hesitates to pursue opportunity, hesitates to speak boldly, hesitates to ask for what he truly wants, not because he lacks desire, but because he fears the emotional pain of being dismissed. And over time, this fear quietly trains him to live beneath his full expression. He lowers his standards before others can reject him. He hides ambition before others can criticize it. He suppresses honesty before others can disagree. He becomes emotionally cautious in order to avoid discomfort. Yet the more cautious he becomes, the more disconnected he feels from his real self. That is the hidden tragedy of rejection fear. It does not only prevent opportunity, it prevents authenticity. The man begins shaping himself around emotional safety rather than truth, He adapts constantly to avoid conflict. He studies reactions obsessively. He becomes overly sensitive to how others respond. And because his emotional stability depends too heavily on external approval, he loses internal certainty. This creates exhaustion, because constantly managing perception requires enormous psychological energy. The man becomes divided between who he truly is and who he believes others will accept. And living in that division weakens confidence over time. Most men never fully recognize this process happening within them. They simply describe themselves as cautious, reserved, selective. But often beneath that caution is fear of emotional exposure, fear of vulnerability, fear that rejection might confirm something painful about their worth. This is why rejection fear can secretly rule behavior for years. It influences careers, relationships, leadership, creativity, communication, and ambition. A man may avoid pursuing a meaningful opportunity not because he lacks ability, but because he unconsciously fears hearing no. Another may remain silent about his true desires because rejection feels emotionally unbearable. Another may settle for environments beneath his potential simply because familiar limitation feels safer than uncertain exposure. The dangerous part is that avoidance temporarily relieves discomfort, and whatever relieves discomfort tends to repeat itself psychologically. The man avoids risk and immediately feels safer. He stays quiet and avoids embarrassment. He lowers ambition and avoids criticism. The nervous system rewards retreat with temporary relief. But over time, the cost becomes enormous because the man slowly disconnects from his own potential. This is why fear becomes so deceptive. It often feels protective in the moment, while quietly destructive over the long term. The man who overcomes rejection fear understands something essential. Rejection does not define value. It defines compatibility, timing, perspective, circumstance. But fearful men personalize every rejection emotionally. They interpret it as evidence that they themselves are inadequate. And because they interpret it this way, they begin avoiding situations where growth requires emotional exposure. But no meaningful life is built without exposure. Every opportunity carries uncertainty. Every relationship carries vulnerability. Every ambition carries the possibility of temporary rejection. The man who waits for emotional guarantees before acting will remain trapped in hesitation forever because guarantees do not exist in meaningful pursuits. Once a man truly accepts this, something shifts internally. He stops interpreting rejection as personal destruction. He sees it as part of movement, part of life, part of growth. He realizes that emotional discomfort cannot kill him, and that realization creates a new kind of courage. Not fearless behavior, but liberated behavior. The man no longer structures his life entirely around emotional avoidance. He speaks more honestly, acts more directly, pursues more boldly. Not because rejection disappears, but because he is no longer allowing it to control identity. This changes relationships with opportunity completely. The fifth ghost is the fear of uncertainty. This fear is especially dangerous because it disguises itself as the need for clarity. The man says he simply wants more information, more certainty, a better plan, better timing. But beneath all of these explanations is often the same hidden truth. He is deeply uncomfortable with the unknown. This fear quietly controls countless lives. Most men want guarantees before movement. They want to know exactly how things will unfold before committing emotionally or strategically. They want certainty about outcomes before risking discomfort. Yet life does not reveal itself that way. The future is always partially uncertain. And because uncertainty cannot be eliminated completely, the fearful mind remains trapped in endless hesitation. This is one of the greatest reasons men stay stuck for years. They keep waiting for a moment when fear disappears completely before acting. But fear rarely disappears before movement. Most confidence is created during action, not before it. The uncertain man does not trust movement itself. He trusts prediction. He wants to calculate outcomes in advance. He wants to minimize risk emotionally. He wants proof that things will work before beginning. And because such proof rarely exists, he delays. This creates the illusion of control. But in reality, avoidance is not control. It is surrender disguised as caution. Look carefully at how uncertainty affects behavior. A man wants to change careers but delays because the outcome is unclear. Another wants to pursue a dream but hesitates because success is not guaranteed. Another wants to transform his life but waits endlessly for perfect conditions. Meanwhile, time continues moving. That is the hidden cost of uncertainty fear. Life slowly passes, while the man waits to feel safe enough to fully live it. And eventually, the avoidance becomes identity. The man begins seeing himself as someone who is always thinking things through, always planning, always preparing. Yet little actually changes because action keeps getting postponed into the future. Most people do not realize that uncertainty itself is part of growth. Every meaningful expansion involves stepping into situations that cannot be fully controlled. The businessman cannot predict every outcome. The leader cannot eliminate all risk. The creator cannot guarantee acceptance. The man pursuing transformation cannot know exactly who he will become beforehand. Yet fearful men resist this reality emotionally. They want life to become predictable before they commit fully to it. But predictability often produces stagnation. Growth requires movement into unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliar territory always contains uncertainty. That is not a flaw in the process, it is the process. The man who overcomes this ghost develops a different relationship with the unknown. He no longer interprets uncertainty as automatic danger. He understands that uncertainty is often evidence that expansion is occurring. He stops demanding complete emotional safety before action. This changes his behavior dramatically. He becomes more decisive, more adaptive, more resilient. He understands that clarity often appears during movement rather than before it. Many answers only reveal themselves after action begins. Many opportunities only appear after initial risk is taken. This is how confidence truly develops, not through endless analysis, but through repeated proof that uncertainty can be survived. Each time the man acts despite incomplete certainty, he weakens fear's authority. He discovers that discomfort is temporary. He learns that adaptability matters more than prediction. He realizes he is more capable than he previously believed. And gradually, uncertainty loses its emotional dominance. The man no longer needs to control every future outcome in advance. He learns to trust his ability to respond instead. That shift creates enormous psychological freedom because the mind is no longer trapped trying to eliminate all unknowns before living fully. This freedom separates decisive men from endlessly hesitant ones. The decisive man accepts uncertainty as part of life. The fearful man waits for uncertainty to disappear. And because it never fully does, he remains waiting. The sixth and final ghost is the fear of failure. This fear is perhaps the most misunderstood because most men think they fear failing publicly. But deeper than public failure is something more painful. Fear that failure may permanently define identity. The man fears discovering limits. He fears discovering weakness. He fears discovering that effort may not immediately produce desired results. And because these fears feel threatening emotionally, he often avoids full commitment altogether. This creates a subtle but destructive pattern. The man never fully applies himself. He hesitates slightly, delays slightly, reduces effort slightly. That way, if things fail, he can tell himself he never truly tried completely. This protects ego temporarily because partial effort creates emotional escape routes. But it destroys growth long term because greatness requires full exposure. A man cannot discover his true capability while constantly protecting himself from disappointment. Yet fearful men spend years doing exactly that. They avoid total commitment because total commitment creates emotional risk. This fear appears everywhere. A man avoids launching the business because failure might embarrass him. Another avoids disciplined action because failing after serious effort would feel unbearable. Another avoids ambitious goals entirely because small goals protect identity more safely. And gradually, life becomes shaped by avoidance instead of possibility. The tragic irony is that failure itself is rarely as destructive as the fear of failure. Most failures are temporary, informative, correctable. but fear magnifies them psychologically until avoidance feels safer than participation. This is how potential quietly dies, not through inability, but through self-protection. The fearful man wants certainty of success before full effort, yet certainty is impossible. Every meaningful achievement contains risk. Every extraordinary pursuit includes periods of setback, confusion, and temporary defeat. The man who overcomes this ghost understands something essential. Failure is data, not identity. A failed attempt does not define a man permanently unless he emotionally attaches identity to the outcome. Strong men separate self-worth from temporary results. They learn, adjust, continue. They do not collapse psychologically every time reality fails to match expectation. This creates resilience, and resilience changes everything. The resilient man is willing to attempt difficult things because temporary failure no longer threatens his entire sense of self. He understands that growth requires experimentation, refinement, repetition, persistence. He stops needing perfection immediately in order to continue moving. Most importantly, he stops viewing failure as evidence that he should quit. He begins seeing it as evidence that he is engaged in something real. Because every meaningful pursuit includes moments where progress looks uncertain. Every transformation contains discomfort. Every ambitious life includes periods of temporary defeat. But defeat only becomes permanent when fear convinces the man to stop entirely. That is the final deception of fear. It does not only create suffering, it creates surrender. And surrender always appears reasonable in the moment. The man says he is being practical, realistic, mature, but often he is simply exhausted from fighting invisible fears he never fully recognized. The moment he finally sees them clearly, something powerful begins happening. The ghosts lose their secrecy. And once fear becomes visible, it becomes far more difficult for it to control him unconsciously. Most men spend their entire lives fighting external battles while remaining unaware of the internal forces secretly shaping their decisions. They believe their greatest obstacles are circumstances, competition, lack of opportunity, or difficult conditions. But the deeper struggle has always existed within the mind itself, because a man can possess intelligence, talent, ambition, and even opportunity, yet still remain trapped if fear quietly controls his behavior from beneath the surface. That is why these fears are called ghosts. They are difficult to detect because they rarely appear openly. They move through thought patterns, emotional reactions, hesitation, excuses, delays, and rationalizations. They influence choices silently. They shape identity gradually. And because they often sound reasonable, most men obey them without realizing it. The fear of insufficient means convinces a man he must wait before beginning. The fear of criticism makes him emotionally dependent on approval. The fear of losing position keeps him protecting familiarity instead of pursuing growth. The fear of rejection weakens authenticity and courage. The fear of uncertainty traps him in endless hesitation, and the fear of failure persuades him to avoid full commitment entirely. Together, these fears create a life built around emotional protection instead of expansion. That is the true danger, because fear rarely destroys potential dramatically. It destroys it quietly through repeated hesitation, through small acts of retreat, through constant delay disguised as intelligence, through the gradual shrinking of ambition until the man becomes comfortable living beneath what he once knew he could become. And the painful part is that this process often happens slowly enough that he barely notices it. Years pass, opportunities disappear, potential weakens, and eventually the man begins calling limitation reality simply because he has lived with it for so long. But the moment awareness enters the process, something changes. Because fear depends heavily on unconscious obedience, it becomes powerful when a man mistakes it for truth. When he believes every fearful thought automatically deserves trust, when he never questions the patterns repeatedly pulling him backward, awareness interrupts that cycle. The man begins observing his hesitation differently. He notices how often fear disguises itself as logic. He sees how many excuses are actually emotional protection mechanisms. He realizes that much of what he called careful thinking was often avoidance wearing the mask of intelligence. This realization is uncomfortable at first, because it forces honesty. A man must confront how often he abandoned himself emotionally, how often he chose safety over growth, how many opportunities were delayed because he wanted certainty before movement, how many times he protected comfort instead of pursuing transformation. But this discomfort is valuable, because truth creates freedom. The moment a man stops blindly obeying fear, he begins reclaiming control over his life. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. He starts acting despite discomfort instead of waiting endlessly for emotional certainty. He begins moving before feeling completely ready. He starts trusting action more than hesitation. And through repeated action, identity changes. That is the deeper transformation most people never understand. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear determine direction. Strong men still feel uncertainty. They still experience doubt. They still encounter hesitation internally. But they no longer surrender authority to those feelings automatically. They recognize them without obeying them. That distinction changes everything. Because once a man separates feeling from action, fear begins losing control over behavior. He no longer needs emotional perfection before movement. He no longer waits for complete confidence before commitment. He understands that growth itself produces confidence over time. This creates momentum, and momentum transforms identity. The man who repeatedly acts despite fear begins proving something powerful to himself. He is capable of movement even in discomfort. He realizes he can survive criticism, rejection, uncertainty, temporary failure, emotional exposure. And once he survives them enough times, they stop appearing as catastrophic threats. They become part of life, part of growth, part of becoming stronger. This is when psychological freedom begins emerging. The man no longer organizes his life entirely around emotional avoidance. He becomes more direct, more disciplined, more intentional, more honest with himself. He stops protecting old limitations simply because they are familiar. He becomes willing to evolve beyond the identity fear once forced him to defend. Others notice this shift immediately. They see greater certainty in his actions, greater calm in his decisions, greater consistency in his behavior. Not because fear disappeared completely, but because fear no longer secretly rules him in the same way. And this creates a completely different life, because the quality of a man's future is directly connected to the degree of control he has over his internal world. A fearful mind creates a restricted life even in favorable conditions. A disciplined mind creates expansion even through difficulty. This is why self-mastery matters so deeply. Not for appearance, not for status, but because the mind shapes direction long before results become visible externally. A man who conquers hidden fear becomes dangerous in the best possible sense of the word. He stops wasting energy on endless hesitation. He stops shrinking himself to remain emotionally safe. He stops delaying his own evolution. His focus strengthens. His discipline deepens. His standards rise. And over time, his life begins reflecting the internal order he has created within himself. This is the true purpose of recognizing the 6 ghosts of fear. Not merely to analyze them intellectually, but to expose them clearly enough that they can no longer operate unconsciously. Because what remains hidden controls behavior. What becomes visible can be transformed. And the man who finally sees fear clearly gains something most people never fully develop: internal authority. He no longer belongs to hesitation. He no longer belongs to avoidance. He no longer belongs to emotional weakness disguised as logic. He belongs to decision, to movement, to purpose, to disciplined action. And once a man reaches that point, his life changes permanently, because he is no longer living as someone secretly ruled by fear. He is finally living as someone capable of ruling himself.